The Galactic Concord had ruled the known universe for 12,000 years. Every intelligent species that discovered how to travel between stars eventually learned about the Concord and its laws. These laws were written in a massive document called the Codex, and every civilization followed them without question. The rules were simple in their core ideas. No species could attack another without going through proper channels. All disputes had to be brought before the Tribunal of Seven Minds, a council of the oldest and beings in the galaxy. Wars could only happen in special zones far from populated worlds. Most importantly, no civilization could be conquered by force. If one species wanted something from another, they had to buy it or trade for it. For 12,000 years, this system worked perfectly. New species would join the conquered, learn the rules, and become peaceful members of galactic society. The last real war had happened 6,000 years ago, and it was now studied in schools as an example of primitive behavior. Ambassador of the Seraphine Collective had welcomed 47 new species into the Concord during her long career. She was considered the best at her job. Her silver-blue skin and 4 graceful arms made her appear both beautiful and wise. When the survey vessel Harmonious Intent discovered a small blue planet called Earth, the Concord naturally sent to make first contact. She arrived with a delegation of 17 different species. Their ships were elegant and shining, designed to impress primitive civilizations. The humans had just developed their first faster-than-light engines, crude devices that barely worked. By Concord standards, they were like children taking their first steps. The meeting took place in a human city called Geneva. Found the humans strange to look at. They had only 2 arms and 2 legs, with soft skin that came in various shades of brown and pink. They wore fabric coverings over their bodies and showed their teeth when they were happy, which found slightly threatening at first. The human representative was a woman named Director. She was small by human standards, with black hair turning gray at the edges and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. She welcomed the delegation politely and listened to their presentation with careful attention. Explained the Codex with pride. She described the peace and prosperity that came from following the rules. She showed holographic images of the great trading hubs where hundreds of species exchanged goods and knowledge. She talked about the medical advances that had ended disease for most conquered members, the cultural exchanges that enriched every civilization, and the security that came from knowing no one would attack you. When she finished, Director smiled and asked questions. She asked about trade tariffs and how they were calculated. She asked about voting rights in the tribunal and whether new species had equal say. She asked about military obligations and whether conquered members had to contribute ships to peacekeeping forces. She asked about the designated war zones and who decided where they were located. Answered each question with growing confusion. No species had ever asked so many questions before. Most civilizations heard about the peace and prosperity and immediately agreed to join. The questions Director asked were not about whether to join, but about the small details that no one ever cared about. After 3 hours of questions, Director thanked the delegation and said humanity would need time to consider the offer. Agreed to return in 3 standard months for their answer. During those 3 months, felt confident. She had seen the humans closely. They were a young species, still fighting among themselves over resources and territory. Their planet showed signs of environmental damage from their own carelessness. Surely they would see the wisdom of joining the conquered and leaving their primitive ways behind. When she returned, Director was waiting with a document. Expected a simple acceptance, perhaps with a few ceremonial changes to make the humans feel important. Instead, she received something that had never happened in 12,000 years of conquered history. Humanity wanted to join, Director explained, but with amendments. They wanted veto power over any conquered decision that affected Earth directly. They wanted to keep their own military forces instead of contributing to the shared peacekeeping fleet. They wanted exemptions from 14 different articles of the Codex, including the rules about designated war zones and the prohibition on weapons of mass destruction. Read the document 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. The translator device in her ear must be malfunctioning. No species negotiated the Codex. The rules were the rules. They had been the rules for 12,000 years, created by beings far wiser than these soft-skinned primitives. She tried to explain this to Director as gently as possible. The Codex was not a suggestion. It was not a starting point for discussion. Every spacefaring civilization followed the same rules because the rules were perfect. They had been refined over to create the most peaceful and prosperous society possible. Director listened politely. Then she said that humanity appreciated the explanation, but their position remained unchanged. They would join on their terms or not at all. Returned to the conquered capital and delivered her report to the Tribunal of 7 Minds. The 7 ancient beings listened with what could only be described as amusement. In their long existence, they had seen many young species act boldly at first before accepting reality. The Grand Arbiter, a being named who had lived for 9,000 years, made the official response. Humanity was welcome to join the conquered under the standard terms. Their requested amendments were, if they chose not to join, they would remain outside galactic society until they changed their minds. This decision was sent to Earth along with an information packet showing the benefits conquered members enjoyed. The tribunal expected humanity to accept within a year. Young species always did. What the conquered did not understand was that humans were different from every other species they had encountered. The galaxy was full of civilizations that had evolved on peaceful worlds, places where cooperation came naturally because survival was easy. Earth was not such a world. Earth was what biologists called a death world. It was a planet where everything tried to kill everything else, where the weather itself could destroy entire cities, where the ground shook and mountains exploded without warning. Humans had evolved not through cooperation but through competition. They had survived ice ages and plagues, wars and famines. They had spread across their world by adapting to every environment, no matter how hostile. Most importantly, humans had spent their entire existence breaking rules. Their history was a story of individuals and groups who refused to accept the limits others tried to place on them. They had rules, certainly, but they also had a long tradition of changing those rules when they no longer served human interests. The conquered saw this as primitive behavior that needed to be corrected. They did not realize it was humanity's greatest strength. 6 months after rejecting the conquered's offer, Earth received visitors of a different kind. 3 massive ships appeared in the solar system, each one larger than a human city. They belonged to the Dominion, one of the founding members of the conquered. They were an ancient species with hard shells and many legs. They had been part of galactic society for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to struggle for survival. They saw humanity's rejection of the Codex not as a problem but as an opportunity. Under Article 7, Section 12 of the Codex, conquered members were entitled to establish economic presence on any non-signatory world. This meant they could take resources from planets that had not joined the conquered. For 12,000 years, this rule had encouraged new species to join quickly. No one wanted their resources taken by others. They declared their intention to mine the asteroid belt near Earth. The rocks floating in space contained valuable metals and minerals. Under conquered law, these resources belonged to whoever could take them, since Earth had refused to join. Director sent a single message to the fleet. She warned them that humanity claimed the entire solar system as its territory. Any attempt to take resources would be considered an act of war. The commander, a large being named, found this amusing. He had studied the human military and found it laughable. Their ships were slow and primitive. Their weapons were crude chemical explosives and simple lasers. The fleet could destroy every human vessel in hours. More importantly, knew the humans would not actually fight. No species fought anymore, not really. The Codex made war almost impossible, and even non-members understood that violence only brought more violence. The humans would complain, perhaps try to negotiate, and eventually accept reality. He ordered his fleet to begin mining operations. The first mining ship was destroyed 6 hours later. The explosion was detected across the solar system. A human vessel, a small and ugly thing that barely looked, had approached the mining ship while broadcasting friendly signals. When it got close enough, it detonated a nuclear device. Received the report with disbelief. Nuclear weapons were primitive technology, abandoned by civilized species thousands of years ago. More importantly, the human ship had sacrificed itself in the attack. The crew had died along with the miners. No species had done such a thing in 6,000 years. The concept of deliberate self-sacrifice was so alien to modern galactic culture that had to check the translation 3 times. Before he could respond, 2 more mining ships were destroyed. Human vessels were emerging from hiding places throughout the asteroid belt, appearing from behind rocks where they had waited in silence. They attacked without warning, without declaration, without any of the formalities the Codex required. Ordered his warships to engage the humans. He expected the primitive vessels to flee once they saw real conquered military power. Instead, the human ships flew directly at his fleet, firing everything they had. The battle lasted 3 days. They had superior technology, superior firepower, and superior numbers. They destroyed human ship after human ship, but for every human vessel that fell, another appeared. And the humans did not fight like civilized beings. They used tricks and traps. They hid and ambushed. They sent false communications and pretended to surrender before attacking again. When it was over, had lost half his fleet. He retreated from the solar system, sending an urgent message to the conquered. The humans had violated dozens of articles of the Codex. They had used nuclear weapons. They had attacked without proper declaration. They had employed deception in combat. The Tribunal of 7 Minds convened in emergency session. For the first time in thousands of years, they faced a species that did not play by the rules. And they had no idea what to do about it. The Tribunal of 7 Minds spent 3 days discussing the human problem. In their long existence, they had dealt with rebellious species before. Young civilizations sometimes needed to learn hard lessons about the importance of following rules. The solution was always the same: send a peacekeeping force, demonstrate overwhelming power, and wait for the rebels to accept reality. Grand Arbiter ordered the formation of the largest peacekeeping armada in 3,000 years. 600 warships from 12 different species gathered at the edge of human space. Their commanders were veterans of countless peacekeeping operations, experienced in showing force without causing unnecessary destruction. The fleet was led by Admiral of the, a species known for their tactical brilliance. His flagship, the Eternal Law, was 5 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to reduce a planet to ash. He had never lost a battle in his 400 years of service. Before entering human space, Admiral sent the required formal communication. Under Article 23 of the Codex, any military action required a declaration of intent and a 48-hour waiting period for the target to respond. The message explained that the fleet was coming to restore order and enforce conquered law. Humanity was given the opportunity to surrender peacefully and accept a tribunal for their violations. Director's response came within an hour. It was brief and unlike anything the conquered had ever received. The message said simply that humanity had not signed the Codex and therefore was not bound by its rules. The peacekeeping fleet was warned to stay out of human space. Any ship that crossed the boundary would be destroyed. There would be no further warnings. Admiral studied the message with something close to confusion. The humans seemed to genuinely believe they could fight the conquered. Their entire species had fewer than 100 warships, most of them small and poorly armed by galactic standards. The peacekeeping fleet outnumbered them 6-1, and them by an even larger margin. He decided the humans must be bluffing. Surely they understood they could not win. This was simply a negotiating tactic, a way to extract better terms from the conquered. Once they saw the fleet in their system, they would surrender and everything would return to normal. The peacekeeping armada crossed into human space on schedule. Admiral expected to meet human representatives within a day, ready to discuss terms. Instead, his fleet encountered something that changed everything. The first wave of human attacks came from everywhere at once. Human ships had been hiding throughout the outer solar system, positioned behind moons and asteroids and in the shadows of gas giants. They had been waiting there for weeks, silent and patient, knowing the conquered would come. When the peacekeeping fleet arrived, they struck from 100 different directions. The attacks were nothing like civilized warfare. Human ships did not line up in formations or exchange fire at proper distances. They flew in wild patterns, using asteroids as cover and planetary gravity to change direction suddenly. They fired missiles loaded with nuclear warheads, weapons so primitive that most conquered ships did not even have defenses against them. Admiral lost 20 ships in the first hour. He ordered his fleet into defensive formation and prepared for proper battle. Under conquered rules of engagement, the humans would now be forced to meet them openly. The superior conquered technology would decide the outcome. But the humans did not follow the rules. Instead of meeting the fleet in open battle, they continued their guerrilla tactics. Small human ships would appear suddenly, fire their weapons, and disappear before conquered vessels could respond. They attacked supply ships and communication relays. They targeted engines instead of weapons, leaving conquered ships drifting helplessly in space. On the third day, Admiral received reports that some of his ships had been boarded. Human soldiers in armored suits had cut through airlocks and entered conquered vessels. They were fighting hand to hand in the corridors, using crude projectile weapons and bladed tools. The conquered crews had no idea how to respond. No species had boarded enemy ships in 6,000 years. The very concept was considered barbaric, something from the Dark Ages before civilization. The soldiers trained for peacekeeping operations knew how to operate weapons systems and maintain order on captured planets. They did not know how to fight in close quarters against enemies who seemed to feel no fear. The reports from the boarded ships were horrifying. Human soldiers moved through the corridors like predators, killing anyone who resisted. They showed no mercy and asked for none. When conquered crews tried to surrender, some humans accepted while others did not. There seemed to be no consistent rule, no way to predict what they would do. By the fifth day, Admiral had lost 100 ships. His communications were disrupted by human jamming devices. His supply lines were cut. Several of his captains were reporting that their crews were afraid to fight. Then came something the Admiral had never experienced in 400 years of service. The humans began what they called psychological warfare. It started with broadcasts sent to every ship in the fleet. Videos showed captured conquered crews being treated well, given food and medical care, and then released in escape pods. The message was clear: surrender and you will live. Other broadcasts showed the destruction of conquered ships, played again and again with human music in the background. The humans released prisoners constantly. Every day, escape pods full of traumatized conquered soldiers drifted back to the fleet. These survivors told stories of human cruelty and human kindness, never knowing which they would receive. Some had been treated as honored guests. Others had been forced to watch their shipmates die. The inconsistency was deliberate, designed to create fear and confusion. Morale in the peacekeeping fleet collapsed. Crews refused to fight. Captains reported that their soldiers were hiding in their quarters, too afraid to go to battle stations. The fear spread like a disease, jumping from ship to ship through communications and rumors. On the ninth day, Admiral ordered a retreat. He had lost 200 ships and accomplished nothing. The humans controlled their space completely, and every attempt to change that had failed. His final report to the tribunal was a document of despair. The humans did not fight like any species the conquered had ever encountered. They used tactics that were explicitly forbidden by the Codex: ambushes, deception, feigned surrenders, attacks on non-military targets. They showed no respect for the rules of civilized warfare. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to enjoy it. The tribunal received this report in silence. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Codex had failed. A single primitive species had defeated a conquered peacekeeping force through sheer refusal to follow the rules everyone else accepted. Emergency meetings were held across the conquered. Species that had been members for thousands of years began asking uncomfortable questions. If the rules could not be enforced against one small species, what was the point of having rules at all? If humans could ignore the Codex without consequences, why should anyone else follow it? 3 founding species announced they were withdrawing from the conquered. They cited security concerns and the need to develop their own independent military forces. 11 other species opened secret negotiations with Earth, hoping to establish friendly relations before the human expansion that everyone now expected. Meanwhile, the humans did something that confused the galaxy even more than their military victories. They sent a diplomatic message to the tribunal. Director appeared on screens across the conquered, speaking calmly and clearly. She said that humanity had no desire for conquest or empire. They did not want to destroy the conquered or replace it with human rule. They simply wanted to be treated as equals. Humanity was willing to negotiate, she explained. They would join galactic society if their reasonable demands were met. They wanted fair representation, they wanted to keep their military, and they wanted the right to defend themselves without asking permission from beings who had never earned their respect. The message ended with an invitation. Any species that wanted peaceful relations with humanity was welcome to send ambassadors to Earth. The humans would receive them with friendship and discuss terms of cooperation. Within a month, 40 species had accepted the invitation. Within a year, humanity had more allies than most conquered founding members. The species that allied with humans found them strange but reliable partners. When humans made an agreement, they kept it. When humans made a threat, they meant it. The tribunal watched all of this with growing desperation. The Codex was crumbling. The system that had maintained peace for 12,000 years was failing because one stubborn species refused to play along. Grand Arbiter made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He requested a private meeting with Director on neutral ground. He wanted to understand how this had happened and whether there was any way to fix it. The meeting was arranged on a space station at the edge of human territory. Arrived with a small escort, feeling something he had not experienced in 9,000 years of existence. He felt uncertain. Director met him in a simple conference room. She was smaller than he expected, this human who had humbled the greatest power in the galaxy. She offered him refreshments and spoke to him politely, as if he were an honored guest rather than a defeated enemy. Asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the war began. How had the humans done it? How had a primitive species with crude technology defeated a civilization that had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years? Director smiled. It was not a cruel smile, but it was not entirely kind either. She said that the answer was simple, though the conquered would probably not like hearing it. The humans had won because the conquered had forgotten what it meant to truly fight for survival. The Codex was designed to prevent conflict, and it had worked perfectly for thousands of years. But in preventing conflict, it had also prevented growth. Species that never struggled never learned to adapt. They became dependent on rules and systems, unable to function when those rules failed. Humanity had grown up differently. On Earth, nothing was guaranteed. Safety had to be earned, not assumed. Rules existed to be tested and changed when they stopped working. This made humans unpredictable, sometimes even dangerous to themselves. But it also made them strong in ways the conquered had forgotten. The Codex assumed that everyone would follow the rules because everyone benefited from following the rules. It never considered what would happen if someone simply refused. When humanity said no, the entire system broke down because it had no way to handle genuine resistance. Listen to this explanation in silence. He wanted to argue that the Codex was still right, that peace was better than war, that rules were necessary for civilization. But he could not deny what had happened. The humans had proven that his 12,000 years of wisdom were not as complete as he had believed. He asked Director what she wanted. What would it take for humanity to stop destroying the conquered? Her answer was simpler than he expected. She wanted a seat at the table, not as a junior member begging for approval, but as an equal partner whose voice mattered. She wanted the Codex reformed to allow for genuine negotiation and disagreement. She wanted a galaxy where strength and weakness, peace and conflict, could exist together instead of one being forbidden in favor of the other. The Grand Arbiter considered this. It would mean the end of everything he had worked to maintain. The perfect system of the Codex would become something messier and more complicated. Disputes would no longer be settled cleanly by tribunal decisions. Species would argue and compete and sometimes fight. But he also saw that the alternative was worse. If the conquered collapsed entirely, there would be chaos. At least this way, some order would remain. He agreed to take her proposal to the tribunal. The reformation of the Galactic Conquered took 5 years. It was the most contentious period in galactic history, with arguments and debates that sometimes seemed endless. Species that had lived by the Codex for thousands of years struggled to accept that the rules they knew were changing. Humanity participated in every discussion, their representatives working alongside beings who had once tried to destroy them. Director became a familiar face in the halls of the tribunal, always calm, always polite, and always absolutely firm on the points that mattered to her people. The new agreement was called the Galactic Compact. It was shorter than the Codex and less absolute. Where the Codex had tried to forbid conflict entirely, the Compact acknowledged that disagreements would happen and created ways to manage them without destroying everything. Member species kept their own military forces instead of contributing to a shared fleet. Disputes could still be brought to a tribunal, but the decisions were no longer binding on species that disagreed. War was still discouraged, but no longer impossible. The designated war zones were eliminated, replaced by rules about protecting civilian populations and limiting destruction. Some species hated the changes. They had grown comfortable with the old system and saw the new one as a step backward toward barbarism. A few from galactic society entirely, sealing their borders and refusing to participate in what they called the corruption of civilization. Others adapted and found that the new system worked better than they expected. Without the rigid rules of the Codex, species began competing in ways that drove innovation. Trade increased as new routes opened. Cultural exchange flourished as beings traveled more freely. The galaxy became more chaotic but also more alive. Humanity took their seat at the table of the reformed tribunal, now called the Council of Voices. Director served as their first representative, though she retired after 3 years and was replaced by a succession of human diplomats. Each one brought the same combination of friendliness and steel that had characterized their species from the beginning. The humans kept their promises. They did not try to conquer the galaxy or dominate other species. They traded fairly, kept their agreements, and defended their allies when needed. They also maintained the largest and most advanced military in known space, a constant reminder of what had happened to the last power that tried to force them into submission. Over time, other species began to adopt human ways of thinking. Not completely, and not always successfully, but the influence spread. Young beings from peaceful worlds started studying human history, fascinated by the stories of struggle and survival. Some even traveled to Earth to experience what they called the death world that had produced such remarkable creatures. Grand Arbiter lived long enough to see the changes settle into a new normal. He had opposed the Reformation at first, clinging to the system he had served for 9,000 years. But as he watched the new compact function, he began to understand something important. The Codex had tried to create peace by eliminating conflict. For 12,000 years it had succeeded, but at a cost no one had noticed. Species protected by the Codex had stopped growing. They had become comfortable and soft, unable to handle challenges because challenges never came. Humanity had shown them what they had lost. The chaos and pain of competition also brought strength and adaptation. A galaxy where nothing was guaranteed was also a galaxy where anything was possible. In his final years, wrote a personal account of the human encounter. It was not an official document, just his own thoughts recorded for those who might want to understand what had happened. He titled it simply, Lessons from the Ungovernable. The name came from the classification that the old tribunal had given to humanity in their archives. When the Codex failed against Earth, the bureaucrats needed a category for a species that could not be controlled. They chose ungovernable, meaning a civilization that would not submit to outside rules. The humans had heard about this classification somehow. Instead of being offended, they seemed proud of it. Some human ships even painted the word on their hulls, wearing it like a badge of honor. Ended his account with a reflection that surprised even himself. He wrote that the humans had not really defeated the conquered. They had saved it. The Codex had become a prison, keeping species safe but also keeping them small. By breaking the rules, humanity had forced the galaxy to grow again. He did not know if this was entirely true. Perhaps he was just an old being trying to find meaning in the collapse of everything he had believed. But he hoped that future generations would remember the lesson. Rules were useful, but they were not sacred. Any system that could not handle challenge was a system waiting to fail. The galaxy continued to change in the years that followed. New species were discovered and invited to join the compact. Some accepted eagerly, excited to be part of a community that valued both cooperation and independence. Others declined, preferring to remain alone. The compact accepted both choices because that was the human way, freedom to choose, with responsibility for the consequences. Earth itself became a destination for beings from across the galaxy. They came to see the death world that had produced the ungovernable humans. They found a planet that was beautiful and terrible, full of life that fought constantly for survival. The visitors often left confused, unable to understand how such a harsh environment had created a species capable of such kindness and such violence. The humans themselves did not change much. They continued to argue among themselves, to compete and cooperate in equal measure, to dream of things that seemed impossible and then make them real. They spread across the galaxy slowly, building colonies and stations, always pushing outward into the unknown. Director died peacefully on Earth at the age of 93. By then, she was considered one of the most important figures in galactic history, the human who had faced down an empire with nothing but words and will. Her last public statement was a message to the young people of all species. She told them to question everything, to never accept limits placed on them by others, and to remember that the rules of today were written by the victors of yesterday. Change was always possible for those willing to fight for it. The galaxy belonged to everyone brave enough to claim their place in it. The message was broadcast across every communication network in known space. Beings from thousands of different species heard it and felt something stir inside them. Some called it hope, Others called it ambition. A few recognized it as the same fire that had allowed humans to stand against the greatest power in the galaxy and refused to bow. In the archives of the Council of Voices, the classification of humanity remained unchanged. They were still listed as ungovernable, the only species to ever earn that designation. The word that had once been a warning had become a description of everything that made humans what they were. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, human ships continued their endless journey outward. They carried with them the lesson they had taught the galaxy, that rules were just agreements, and agreements only held when everyone believed in them. When the rules stopped serving the people, it was time to write new rules. The galaxy had learned this lesson the hard way. They would not forget it easily.